The village of Little Hemsby had settled into the familiar quiet of a January morning, the sort of peacefulness that made even the occasional squabble over parish matters seem almost charming. Snow lay in a soft, glimmering blanket over rooftops and hedges, muting the sounds of the world to a gentle hush. In the center of the village, the old Witchwood estate prepared to host a gathering that promised a rare excitement for the local residents. The annual winter garden party, albeit slightly unconventional given the season. Miss Jane Marple, as she usually did, had observed the preparations from a discreet distance, perched in the corner of the tea shop with her knitting basket beside her. She took in the sight of villagers scurrying about, their cheeks pink with cold and anticipation. It was not that she loved parties, though she enjoyed the warmth of a gathering, but she delighted always in the little movements, the nervous tics, the anxious smiles that people could not help but betray. And such gatherings, she knew, revealed more than they concealed. On that particular morning, the Witchwood garden, normally an orderly expanse of manicured lawns and topiary, was transformed into a winter wonderland. Twinkling fairy lights hung from bare branches like suspended stars, and a temporary marquee had been erected near the fountain. Inside, trays of sandwiches and delicate pastries awaited the early arrivals, while outside, snow crunched pleasantly underfoot as children and adults alike wandered about, greeting each other in the cautious manner of villagers who had spent the winter months apart. Miss Marple had been invited naturally, though she preferred to arrive later, observing first, speaking sparingly, and letting her presence be felt through small, unobtrusive questions. Today, however, she had paused on the threshold of the marquee when a familiar voice called her name. "Ah, Miss Marple!" exclaimed Mrs. Penelope Witchwood, the estate's matron, bustling forward in a woolen coat the color of ripe chestnuts. "I do hope you've brought your warmth with you. It is bitter, even for January." "Good morning, Mrs. Witchwood," Miss Marple replied, her eyes noting the slight tremor in the hostess's hands as she gestured toward the crowd. "The snow is very forgiving today. It hides many things." Mrs. Witchwood laughed, a sound more brittle than cheerful. "We do hope it hides nothing unpleasant, but of course, one never knows." Her eyes flickered briefly toward the center of the lawn, where a small group had gathered around a figure standing with unusual stiffness. Miss Marple, attentive as ever, followed the glance. The figure in question was Arthur Halloway, the village's most celebrated painter. He was tall, thin, and habitually precise in posture and attire, a man whose every movement suggested control. Today, he held a sketchbook under his arm, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "A perfect morning for capturing. The frost on the hedgerows," he said to those nearby, speaking with the air of someone accustomed to admiration. Yes, but do take care," called a voice from behind him. Harriet Pemberton, his neighbor and frequent companion in such gatherings. She waved a gloved hand in his direction, her tone carrying both affection and warning. "One slip on this ice, and you'll ruin more than your morning." Miss Marple, sipping a modest cup of tea, noticed the slight tension in Halloway's jaw, the way he glanced toward a smaller group near the fountain, where two men conversed quietly, their heads close together. One was Charles Whitmore, the local solicitor, known for his meticulous record-keeping and a temper that simmered under polite restraint. The other was a newcomer to the village, a Mr. Edwin Calver, whose recent purchase of the old mill house had been the subject of no small speculation. Both men seemed animated, but their words were inaudible from where Miss Marple sat. As the morning passed, the party settled into its customary rhythm. Tea was poured, small pastries vanished in polite handfuls, and conversation flowed from trivialities about the frost to more pointed remarks about who had, or had not, attended the previous summer gathering. Miss Marple noticed that Halloway had positioned himself closer to the edge of the garden, where the snow lay thickest. He appeared restless, glancing repeatedly toward the tree line as though awaiting someone, or something. "Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple murmured to Mrs. Witchwood as she passed by, in her usual fashion of remarking upon what others might overlook. How Mr. Halloway seems to regard that far corner as though it held a secret he dared not speak aloud. Mrs. Witchwood smiled nervously. "Oh, you always notice everything, Miss Marple. Perhaps he is merely contemplating the landscape for his sketches. He is quite intense in his methods." Miss Marple inclined her head, not pressing the matter further. It was often in such intensity that she found the first hints of a disturbance. And disturbances, however subtle, rarely remained buried in Little Hemsby for long. It was just after noon when the unexpected event occurred. The children, encouraged by the novelty of a snow-covered garden, had begun an impromptu snowball fight, their laughter ringing through the crisp air. Adults watched, some amused, others mildly annoyed by the intrusion on their carefully arranged social decorum. Halloway, still standing apart, suddenly let out a startled exclamation. A moment later, a commotion arose near the fountain. A maid screamed, a shrill, terrified sound that carried across the snow. Guests clustered, murmuring in alarm as Halloway's sketchbook lay abandoned, its pages fluttering in the icy breeze. Someone shouted, "He's gone! Arthur Halloway! He's vanished!" Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. She did not move immediately, allowing her eyes to sweep the scene. Panic rippled across the faces of familiar villagers, but her attention went elsewhere, toward footprints in the snow, the subtle disturbances around the fountain, and the anxious gestures of those closest to the missing man. It was clear, even before any official inquiry, that the day's tranquility had been shattered. The painter, Arthur Halloway, had vanished from the heart of Little Hemsby's most public gathering, and the question on everyone's lips, whispered in shocked tones and urgent speculation, was the same. Who could have taken him, and why? Miss Marple, however, merely adjusted her scarf, her mind quietly piecing together possibilities as the village descended into a nervous hum of conjecture. She understood that the answers would not be found in the commotion, but in the subtle shifts of human behavior, the slight hesitation, the unintended glance, the tiny lie that could unravel the truth. The game, she knew, had begun. The news of Arthur Halloway's disappearance traveled faster than the January wind through Little Hemsby. By mid-afternoon, the Witchwood estate had become a hub of anxious speculation. Villagers arrived in small groups, each bringing their own interpretation of events, none of which coincided. Yet all were delivered with the conviction of undeniable truth. Mrs. Witchwood did her best to maintain decorum, standing near the fountain with a hand pressed to her slightly trembling chest. "Now please," she said, her voice wavering, "let us not jump to conclusions. He may have simply wandered off, perhaps slipped on the snow, or—" "Slipped?" interrupted Mr. Charles Whitmore, adjusting his spectacles with unusual impatience. "On the estate's main lawn, with half the village watching? Impossible. There's more to this. I suspect foul play." His words sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. "Foul play?" echoed Mrs. Pemberton, her voice pitched with dramatic horror. "Good heavens, who would want to harm Arthur? Why, he's been nothing but kind and helpful to everyone here. Remember the sketches he made for the school? The portraits of the children?" Miss Marple, leaning against the edge of the marquee and observing quietly, noted the inconsistencies in their concern. While Mrs. Pemberton's grief seemed genuine, Whitmore's certainty carried a hint of personal investment, a desire for control over an event that had clearly unsettled him. Meanwhile, whispers threaded through the smaller clusters of villagers. "I saw him talking to that newcomer, Edwin Calver," a housekeeper murmured to her companion. "You know, the man who bought the old mill house last month. I didn't trust him from the start." "Bah," said another, a butcher named Mr. Tilling. "Calver's only been in Little Hemsby a few weeks. He wouldn't have the nerve to do anything so dramatic. No, mark my words, it's someone who knows Arthur well, someone he trusted." Miss Marple's attention drifted to the small footprints in the thin layer of snow near the fountain. They were irregular, as if the person had paused, reconsidered, or perhaps been guided by another. She committed them to memory without remark, for details like these rarely spoke loudly enough for the untrained eye. By mid-afternoon, the village hall had become the informal center of discussion. Groups huddled in corners, speaking in hushed tones, as if raising their voices might alert the culprit still lurking nearby. The vicar, Reverend Barnaby, attempted to calm the assembly. "We must not allow speculation to take the place of reason. Arthur Halloway is missing, yes, but it is far too early to accuse anyone of wrongdoing." But Miss Marple, observing the room, noted how Reverend Barnaby's hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the fireplace, how his gaze flicked to the window as though seeking an escape from the tension he had failed to contain. Even the most composed individuals revealed cracks when confronted with the unknown. It was Mrs. Penelope Witchwood who broke the mounting tension with a practical suggestion. "Perhaps we should divide into parties and search the estate and surrounding fields. The snow will preserve tracks for a while. If Arthur has wandered off, we may yet find him." "Excellent idea," said the head gardener, Mr. Hemsley, though his voice betrayed unease. "The snow is deceptive. You never know where it might conceal a treacherous patch or a hole in the ground." "Or worse," muttered Mrs. Pemberton under her breath, though loud enough for Miss Marple to catch the tremor of fear. Miss Marple, meanwhile, allowed the villagers to organize themselves into search parties, knowing full well that no search could reveal what they were not perceptive enough to notice. Her mind, instead, sifted through the subtle tensions she had observed. The fleeting glance between Whitmore and Calver, the hesitant tone of Mrs. Pemberton, the restrained irritation of the vicar, even the stiff posture of the gardener when asked to lead a party across the snow. Every motion, every hesitation, was a small puzzle piece. As the search parties dispersed, gossip did not abate. It only multiplied. In the warm corners of the village inn, patrons speculated wildly. "Perhaps he's had an accident," suggested the postmistress, who wrung her hands nervously. "Or perhaps he left of his own accord. He did have a temper, you know. Remember the argument with the art dealer last month?" "Oh, yes," said the innkeeper, shaking his head. "That was a public quarrel, but Arthur never struck anyone, at least not openly. Still, someone could have taken offense. A bitter rival, perhaps." "Rival?" Mrs. Pemberton's voice quivered. "You must be joking. Arthur Halloway has always been amiable. It's unthinkable he has enemies in Little Hemsby." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a small group by the hearth. Young, women whispering, nodding toward Edwin Calver as if merely his presence explained everything. "He's new," they murmured. "He must have had something to do with it. How convenient for a newcomer to make such a mark." The detective and Miss Marple observed without judgment. Human beings had a tendency to assign guilt to the most unfamiliar, a habit born from fear and instinct. Yet she also noted the less obvious patterns, the subtle alliances, the slight tension between long-time villagers, the concealed resentment behind polite smiles. In her experience, the stranger was often only a convenient scapegoat. The truth lay elsewhere, hidden beneath layers of familiarity and assumption. As evening approached, the search parties returned, none having discovered the missing painter. The village square filled once more with worried faces, each person offering conjectures, some reasonable, some absurd. Whitmore declared, "It must be premeditated. Someone plotted this." Mrs. Pemberton, in contrast, whispered to anyone who would listen, "Perhaps he is hiding or testing us in some eccentric artist's fashion. Surely he would not abandon us without reason." Miss Marple, sitting quietly on a bench near the fountain, knitted steadily, her sharp eyes sweeping the gathering once again. She considered the reactions, the discrepancies in speech and posture, and the subtle avoidance of certain glances. All of it told a story that no loud accusation or anxious speculation could reveal. Yes, thought Miss Marple, the village reacted predictably. But the answers, as always, would not come from what they feared or imagined. They would come from the tiny, almost invisible details that others overlooked. The tremor of a hand, the hesitation before a denial, the brief flash of recognition in a guilty eye. And already, Miss Marple felt the first threads of the truth tugging gently at her mind, delicate as frost on the hedge, waiting to be traced. Miss Marple returned home that evening with the quiet deliberation of someone who had already begun to assemble the invisible threads of a complex tapestry. The village of Little Hemsby had, by now, settled into a tense hush. The snow lay undisturbed in some places, trampled in others, and footprints of search parties crisscrossed the gardens, offering no clear pattern, no conclusive direction. To the casual observer, the disappearance of Arthur Halloway might have seemed an unsolvable mystery. But Miss Marple had long learned that human nature itself, with all its quirks and contradictions, often revealed more than the harshest scrutiny. She began, as she usually did, with a careful review of the day's events in her mind. Who had been present, and how had they behaved? Whitmore's insistence on foul play, the vicar's concealed unease, the newcomer Calver's silent observation, and Mrs. Pemberton's nervous concern all carried subtle significance. Each gesture, each glance, had spoken volumes to her trained eye. And though she appeared content to sip her tea and knit in the evenings, Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. The following morning, she visited the Witchwood estate under the pretense of offering sympathy and inquiring after any developments. Mrs. Penelope Witchwood met her at the door, cheeks flushed with cold and worry. "We've searched everywhere," she said. "The snow will not last forever, and I fear Arthur may have wandered too far." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle yet probing. "Or perhaps he was guided somewhere." She observed the brief flicker of unease cross Mrs. Witchwood's face, small, nearly imperceptible, but telling. Miss Marple spent the morning walking the estate grounds, ostensibly to admire the winter scenery, but in reality to examine the layout, the snow, and the footprints that remained. She noticed subtle details that others had overlooked. The irregular spacing of some tracks, as though someone had paused and turned. A thin smear of red on a corner of the sketchbook left by Halloway, faint but unmistakable, and the trampled snow leading not toward the forest, as most suspected, but along a little-used path behind the gardener's shed. Inside the house, she observed the behavior of those present. Mrs. Pemberton lingered near the fireplace, wringing her hands, glancing repeatedly toward the garden. Miss Marple noticed the slight hesitation in her speech, the careful way she avoided certain topics. Whitmore, meanwhile, busied himself with a notebook, recording observations with the air of someone who believed facts alone could solve everything. He ignored entirely the nervous glances exchanged between Calver and the gardener, as if preferring not to acknowledge them. Calver, in contrast, appeared unusually calm, almost detached. He spoke to few, smiled politely, and kept his gaze steady, yet Miss Marple observed the occasional flicker in his eyes, a micro-expression that suggested he was monitoring more than he revealed. Miss Marple's approach was never to confront immediately. She allowed villagers to reveal themselves through ordinary conversation, through the habits that betrayed hidden fears or concealed intentions. She asked no pointed questions, but she listened. Over tea in the estate's sunroom, she noted the subtleties, Mrs. Pemberton's fingers fidgeting with the teacup handle, Whitmore's habitual clearing of his throat before speaking, and Calver's ever-so-brief glance at the door whenever the maid entered. "What a shame," remarked Mrs. Witchwood softly, "that Arthur has been taken from us in such a way. One does not simply vanish from a gathering with so many eyes about." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "but one must consider who might benefit from his absence." She allowed the words to hang in the air without further comment. merely observing. It was the small details that caught her attention most. The sketchbook, half open and fluttering with a slight breeze, revealing a page where Arthur had sketched a faint outline of a figure in the trees. The glove that lay discarded near the fountain, too small for any of the searchers, and, curiously, the subtle imprint of something in the snow that appeared to be made by a cane. She made a mental note of each, understanding that in time they would form a pattern that others could not yet discern. By midday, news had spread to the local constable, a mild-mannered man named Inspector Havisham. He arrived promptly, notebook in hand, eager to apply logic to what seemed, to him, a straightforward case of accidental disappearance. "Miss Marple," he said politely, "perhaps you can tell me if you noticed anything unusual yesterday." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Everything is unusual if one knows what to observe, Inspector, but I did notice a few things that others might have missed." She mentioned only the smallest hints: the erratic footprints, the smear on the sketchbook, the discarded glove, and the faint cane imprint. Havisham, accustomed to relying on tangible evidence rather than human intuition, noted her remarks, but did not yet comprehend their significance. "I shall instruct the search parties to examine those areas again," he said, nodding decisively. "If there's any sign of foul play, we will find it." Miss Marple, however, knew the truth. The answer would not be found solely in footprints or misplaced objects. It lay in the subtle interplay of relationships, in the minor inconsistencies of speech, in the unspoken grudges and alliances that pulsed quietly beneath the polite veneer of village life. As she prepared to leave the estate, Miss Marple glanced back toward the garden. The snow continued to fall lightly, erasing some of the footprints, softening the world into silence. "The snow is very forgiving," she murmured to herself, echoing her earlier words. "It hides what it wishes, yet it also preserves what is truly important." And with that thought, she returned to her cottage, where she would spend the remainder of the day quietly reviewing each observation, connecting each fragment of human behavior, and allowing her mind to trace the invisible lines that led, inevitably, to the heart of the mystery. The villagers, unaware of the silent scrutiny, went about their discussions and searches, blind to the fact that Miss Marple had already begun to see the outlines of a solution. While they speculated wildly, she understood that every nervous glance, every tremor of the voice, and every carefully hidden hesitation was a thread in the tapestry of truth. And in Little Hemsby, as the day waned, Miss Marple quietly considered her next steps. The true story of Arthur Halloway's disappearance would not emerge from noise or panic, but from the careful study of human nature, the subtle truths that even the most observant eye could overlook. By the next morning, the villagers of Little Hemsby had settled into a tense routine. Rumors flowed more freely than snow melt in spring, and everyone had, naturally, formed their own theory of Arthur Halloway's disappearance. Most pointed fingers at the most convenient suspect, Edwin Calver, the recent arrival to the village. A man of reserve, with eyes that seemed to calculate before speaking, he had become an immediate figure of suspicion. Calver's stoic demeanor, which might have been merely courtesy or caution in another setting, now appeared to the villagers as cold and deliberate. "He has no roots here," whispered Mrs. Pemberton to a group of curious onlookers. "How could he possibly be innocent when he is so detached?" Even the more rational, or at least polite, villagers could not help but entertain such ideas. The fact that Calver had been seen conversing with Whitmore the day before the party, a mere whisper of speculation, was enough for them to conclude that he had conspired in Halloway's disappearance. It was a convenient narrative, simple and satisfying, the sort of explanation that humans readily adopt when confronted with uncertainty. Miss Marple, as always, listened quietly. She observed the interactions, the half-hidden glances, and the nervous shifts of weight. Calver did not fit the obvious pattern of a guilty party. He smiled when spoken to, helped the elderly fetch their wraps, and answered questions without hesitation. Yet Miss Marple noticed something subtler, a slight twitch of his fingers when the subject of Halloway arose, and a tendency to position himself nearer the walls, as if wanting to remain at a distance from the collective hysteria. Not guilt, she concluded, but caution, an instinct that most villagers misread entirely. Inspector Havisham, for his part, was eager to pin the responsibility where it seemed easiest. "It must be him," he told Whitmore as they examined the sketchbook in the Witchwood drawing-room. "A newcomer, a stranger, he had motive and opportunity." Whitmore, delighted to be drawn into the investigation, nodded vigorously. "Exactly. And mark my words, the village will breathe easier when the matter is resolved." The sketchbook, now carefully laid out on a table, revealed the last image Arthur had drawn before vanishing. It was faint and hurried, a shadowy figure near the tree line, not fully defined, but with an unmistakable presence. Miss Marple bent slightly to study it, her sharp eyes noting the small details, the way the figure's hands were positioned, the tilt of the head, the uneven strokes that suggested distraction or haste. "Interesting," she murmured to herself. "The last impression he left may not be of where he went, but of what he feared." Meanwhile, the village whispered of old grievances, long-forgotten slights, and petty rivalries that might have motivated a more intimate hand in Halloway's disappearance. Some recalled his dispute with the local art dealer. Others mentioned a fleeting quarrel with the vicar over a commission for a stained-glass window. Even the gardener, Mr. Hemsley, who seemed outwardly neutral, was scrutinized for the small irritations he had shown when the painter walked too near the flower beds. Miss Marple observed each reaction carefully. Whitmore's eagerness to accuse Calver was obvious, but she noted also the subtle ways he avoided discussing his own brief, private disagreements with Halloway. The vicar's gentle demeanor was laced with unspoken tension when asked about Arthur's habits. And Mrs. Pemberton, though she openly decried any notion of wrongdoing by her friend, revealed nervous gestures, fiddling with her scarf, adjusting her gloves, even glancing at doors as if watching for someone she hoped would not arrive. The inspector, though diligent, was limited by protocol and habit. He questioned the obvious, chased the tangible, and relied heavily on witness statements that were often contradictory or incomplete. Yet even as he did so, Miss Marple quietly considered the psychological subtleties, tiny hesitations, misplaced emphasis, and the peculiar relief some villagers displayed when the focus shifted away from themselves. These, she knew, were far more revealing than statements dictated by fear or courtesy. By afternoon, Calver found himself the center of unwanted attention. Whispers followed him through the village streets. He was seen near the fountain before Arthur vanished. He was talking to Whitmore in private. He arrived in Little Hemsby only last month. How could he know anything about the estate? Calver bore it with composed politeness, yet Miss Marple, from her discreet vantage, noticed his subtle responses. The brief narrowing of his eyes, the careful placement of his hands, the slight shift in stance. Each was a signal, not of guilt, but of someone aware of suspicion and choosing restraint rather than confrontation. Miss Marple's insights deepened when she later visited the Halloway household. Arthur's widow, or rather his housekeeper, who handled correspondence and daily affairs, spoke of her employer's habits, the tendency to rise early, to walk through the garden regardless of snow, to speak cryptically about fears of some unnamed, encroaching threat. "He was always nervous this winter," she confided, wringing her hands. "I thought it only the cold, but—" He seemed distracted, as if watching shadows. Miss Marple made a quiet note of this. The nervousness, she realized, was consistent with the last sketch and with the subtle tension she had observed at the party. The source of anxiety was not Edwin Calver, nor Whitmore, nor any of the immediate villagers. It was something, or someone, closer, familiar enough to be overlooked, yet capable of instilling genuine fear. Even as the first suspects were questioned and suspicion circled Calver like a hawk, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the minor details. Others dismissed. The cane imprint in the snow, the smear on the sketchbook, the abandoned glove, and the small but deliberate placement of footprints leading toward the less traveled paths. These, she knew, were threads leading to the true story. Threads invisible to the eager eye but impossible to ignore for one who observed human behavior with patience and precision. By the end of the day, the village had, in a sense, settled on a narrative. Calver was the obvious suspect, and whispers circulated that he would be questioned again. Yet Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the fire, allowed herself a small smile. The obvious suspect, she mused, was rarely the real one. The true puzzle lay in the subtler details, in the understated signals that revealed motive, fear, and intent. And as little Hemsby's snow-covered streets grew silent under the deepening twilight, Miss Marple quietly prepared for the next step, watching the villagers more closely than ever, listening more carefully than before, and beginning the patient work of untangling the web that led to Arthur Halloway's disappearance. The morning following Arthur Halloway's disappearance dawned pale and still over Little Hemsby, the snow a thin, sparkling crust over every path and hedge. The village, still abuzz with speculation, seemed to move under a fragile tension, each resident caught between concern, curiosity, and the instinctive desire to assign blame. Miss Marple, however, was not distracted by rumor or conjecture. She had long learned that the truth, particularly one so closely tied to human behavior, revealed itself only in the smallest, most overlooked details. Miss Marple began her day at the Witchwood estate once more. While the search parties had scoured the garden and the nearby tree lines, she preferred to examine areas less obvious, places the casual observer dismissed or walked past without thought. She took her time, stepping delicately over the snow, noting the impressions left in hidden corners. The subtle scuff near a gate hinge, the faint smudge of paint on a stone, the disturbance in the thin ice atop the fountain's basin. It was there, at the fountain, that she noticed something peculiar. Most villagers had examined the fountain for obvious signs of a struggle or footprints, but they had overlooked a tiny, nearly invisible detail, a faint smear of crimson, partially obscured by snow on the otherwise polished stone edge. Not enough to indicate violence on a grand scale, certainly, but enough to suggest a minor scrape or the transfer of something from one hand to the surface. Miss Marple bent closer, noting its irregular shape, and allowed her mind to trace the possibilities. It was not random, it was deliberate, or at least accidental in a way that revealed intent. She pocketed the observation carefully, considering it alongside other overlooked clues. The abandoned sketchbook, the glove too small for the men who had arrived to search, and the faint cane, imprint leading toward the gardener's shed. Individually, each seemed inconsequential. Taken together, however, they formed a pattern, one invisible to those seeking only the obvious. Later that morning, she visited the Halloway house, ostensibly to offer her assistance in sorting through correspondence and personal effects left in the painter's sudden absence. The house itself was a repository of careful habits, of routines and rhythms observed over years. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the scene with quiet precision. A chair slightly out of place, a cup of tea cooling on a side table, a palette of paints left untouched from the previous evening. These were small, unremarkable details to anyone else. But to Miss Marple, they were the fingerprints of human behavior, the silent testimony of anxiety, fear, or hidden motives. While arranging letters, she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked into the pages of Halloway's personal sketchbook. Most would have overlooked it, pressed flat beneath the larger sheets of work, but Miss Marple's keen eye detected the subtle crease. The paper contained a brief note in Arthur's hand, a hurried message almost obscured by the snow-streaked smudge. "I fear someone I know is watching too closely. Must step lightly." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought. The note suggested caution and awareness, a clear sign that Holloway had been observing someone, or suspected he was being observed. This was more telling than any footprint, any glance, or any whispered accusation. It revealed not the location of his absence, but the cause, the fear that had driven him into the snow and perhaps into danger. She spent the next hour speaking quietly with the housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, whose nervous demeanor betrayed the stress of recent events. "He was uneasy these past few weeks," Mrs. Pritchard confessed, wringing her hands. "I thought it was the cold or the winter blues, but he kept checking doors, glancing at windows, almost as if someone were in the house or watching the grounds. I never imagined he would disappear." Miss Marple nodded, listening closely to the precise words, the pauses, the points of emphasis. People often revealed more than they intended through the minor hesitations and the subtle phrasing of speech. Mrs. Pritchard's account confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected. Holloway's apprehension was not a general unease, but directed toward someone familiar, someone with access or proximity. By mid-afternoon, she returned to the Witchwood estate, where the villagers had gathered again to discuss theories. Their attention, predictably, remained on Edwin Calver, whose polite demeanor did little to convince them of his innocence. "He was near the fountain," a maid repeated, "just before Arthur vanished." Miss Marple observed without comment, noting the collective focus on Calver. Human nature, she mused, was such that the unfamiliar drew suspicion, while those closest, those known and trusted, escaped scrutiny. Yet she already had the faintest thread leading away from Calver toward someone entirely unexpected, a detail the others would dismiss as too inconspicuous to matter. Her eyes caught a small movement near the garden edge. The gardener, Mr. Hemsley, bending low to retrieve a broken branch. A casual observer might have seen nothing, but Miss Marple noted the care with which he handled the branch, the slight tremor in his fingers, the nervous glance toward the main house. There was something deliberate in his actions, a small anxiety that hinted at knowledge of more than he admitted. By evening, she returned to her cottage, her mind quietly assembling the puzzle. The hidden clues, the smear of crimson, the cane imprint, the abandoned glove, the note in the sketchbook, and the gardener's subtle agitation formed a web that could only be understood through careful, patient observation. Each element, trivial on its own, became significant when placed alongside the others. Miss Marple considered the villagers' focus on Calver. It was natural, she acknowledged, that fear of the unknown prompted such assumptions. Yet the true answer, as always, was likely to be far closer than anyone imagined. The hidden clue, the smallest, most easily overlooked mark, often revealed the character of the person who had acted, as much as the act itself. And in Little Hemsby, as the snow settled quietly around her windows, Miss Marple sensed that she had already begun to glimpse the pattern that others would miss entirely. She settled into her chair with her knitting, listening to the faint crackle of the hearth fire. The village, still abuzz with gossip and speculation, was oblivious to the fact that a subtle, almost imperceptible clue had already been discovered. In Miss Marple's mind, the day's events had produced the first thread of truth, a thread she intended to follow with patience, delicacy, and an unerring understanding of human nature. For in mysteries, as in life, it was the small, hidden details, the ones everyone else dismissed, that often carried the weight of revelation. The following day, the tension in Little Hemsby had grown almost tangible. Snow continued to lie in crisp layers across the village lanes, muffling footsteps and softening voices, yet beneath the surface, the undercurrent of suspicion and unease thrummed with increasing intensity. Miss Marple, as always, moved quietly through the village, observing without being observed, her mind gathering the subtle signs that others overlooked. At mid-morning, she visited the post office, where villagers had gathered in small whispering groups. Conversations rose and fell in hurried bursts, as if each speaker feared being overheard by the one they most distrusted. Here, the first hints of deeper secrets began to surface. Mrs. Pemberton spoke of a long-forgotten quarrel between Arthur Halloway and the local art dealer, Mr. Graves. "It was years ago," she murmured, but Arthur had refused to sell him the landscapes he'd painted of the surrounding hills. There were words exchanged, sharp words that some still recall with resentment. Miss Marple noted the emphasis on "some still recall," the careful phrasing that hinted at deliberate omission. Villagers often cloaked resentments in politeness, revealing their significance only through subtle intonation or the quick avoidance of certain details. Graves, she knew, was not merely a business competitor, but a man with grudges that had simmered quietly, like embers beneath a winter hearth. Later, she walked along the main street, where the inn's windows glimmered with pale light. Inside, she overheard conversations between young women gossiping about Edwin Calver. "I saw him speaking to Halloway last week," one whispered. "He seemed tense, as though pressing him for something." "And what could he want?" asked another, laughing nervously. "He's new, isn't he? Surely he would not." Miss Marple's attention drifted, however, to a different figure. Mr. Hemsley, the gardener, who had appeared briefly behind the inn's shutters. His fingers were clenched around a handkerchief, and his eyes darted toward the street, then down to the snow at his feet. The movement was almost imperceptible, yet it told a story of quiet agitation, a tension he could not disguise, however politely he greeted the villagers. By noon, Miss Marple had called upon the vicar, Reverend Barnaby, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for a small memorial service should Halloway remain missing. In the warm, book-lined study, she observed the subtle tremor of his hands as he adjusted the papers on his desk, the faint flush in his cheeks, the way his gaze lingered on a small painting depicting the local countryside, one of Halloway's earlier works. "It is such a shame," the vicar murmured. "Arthur was... well, he had an eye for the beauty in all things, and yet perhaps he underestimated human nature." He paused, glancing toward the window. "There are old grievances, you see, even among friends, long-buried misunderstandings, resentments that fester quietly. One never knows what might rise to the surface under stress." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Indeed, Reverend, and sometimes what appears trivial to outsiders may weigh heavily upon the mind of those involved." Her soft phrasing allowed the vicar to continue, revealing in careful, almost unconscious detail the tensions between several villagers. A dispute over a neglected hedge, an argument over property boundaries, and a disagreement about the placement of memorial trees in the estate's garden. To the casual ear, these might have seemed inconsequential, but to Miss Marple, each was a potential thread in the tapestry of motive, small grievances magnified by fear and circumstance. By mid-afternoon, she had arranged brief, casual encounters with several key figures, always in settings that appeared accidental or routine. With Mrs. Pemberton, she discussed the local school's art program, noting the careful avoidance of Halloway's personal matters. With Whitmore, she spoke of cataloguing village history, noting his impatience when the conversation strayed from his own perceived importance. Each exchange offered subtle insights into character, revealing the layers beneath polite civility. Miss Marple's observations began to coalesce that evening when she returned to the Witchwood estate for tea. Several villagers were present: Whitmore, Mrs. Pemberton, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, all engaged in quiet conversation. Their words, while superficially polite, betrayed small fissures of tension. Miss Marple noted a flicker of irritation in Whitmore's eyes whenever Mrs. Pritchard mentioned Halloway's habits, and the way Mrs. Pemberton's hands trembled when speaking of the painter's disappearance. It was the gardener, however, who provided the most revealing insight, though he did so unintentionally. As he adjusted the hearth logs, his elbow knocked a small ornament, a delicate glass bird, onto the floor. It shattered, sending fragments across the rug. His face went pale, and he muttered a quick apology, glancing furtively toward the others as if the act itself had revealed a guilt he could not articulate. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever, caught the moment. The flinch, the hesitation, the careful glance toward the assembled group. These were the hallmarks of someone concealing more than mere embarrassment. They were the signs of knowledge, of involvement, of awareness that the truth might be revealed at any moment. Throughout the evening, she continued her subtle inquiries. She spoke casually about Halloway's routines, his penchant for walking alone in the snow, and the little eccentricities that made him both endearing and, to some, frustrating. In each conversation, Miss Marple carefully watched for signs of recognition, surprise, or anxiety, indicators that could reveal more than confession ever would. By the time the villagers departed, leaving the estate quiet once more, Miss Marple had amassed a wealth of observations. Old grudges, whispered resentments, minor disputes, all were now pieces of a larger puzzle. The first suspects, naturally, had drawn attention for their conspicuousness, yet it was the subtle, almost invisible signals, the trembling hands, the careful avoidance of certain subjects, the tiny reactions to ordinary events, that suggested the true web of motive. Miss Marple settled by the fire in the quiet of the evening, her knitting resting in her lap as she reviewed the day's revelations. She considered each villager in turn, the housekeeper's nervous honesty, the vicar's concealed unease, Whitmore's eagerness to accuse, Mrs. Pemberton's polite distress, and Hemsley's small telling gestures. Together, they painted a complex picture, one in which motives were layered and human nature, with all its contradictions, offered far more insight than any overt statement. For in Little Hemsby, as Miss Marple understood, it was not always the obvious suspect who concealed the truth. It was the subtle, almost imperceptible signs, those tiny contradictions, hesitations, and concealed anxieties that pointed most directly to the heart of the mystery. The morning after the Witchwood estate gathering, the village awoke to an unsettling revelation. A second, unexpected event had occurred overnight, one that none had anticipated. It was the discovery of Arthur Halloway's easel, abandoned and upright near the edge of the snow-laden orchard, with a freshly completed canvas leaning precariously against it. The painting itself was strange, almost eerie in its subject. A shadowy figure standing at the threshold of a dense copse of trees, the snow around its feet disturbed in a manner strikingly similar to the tracks Miss Marple had noted days before. The villagers, already tense from Arthur's disappearance, were immediately thrown into fresh speculation. Some believed the painting had been left intentionally, a message from the missing painter. Others, more imaginative or superstitious, whispered that Halloway's spirit had somehow returned to communicate, frozen in artistic form before vanishing again. Only Miss Marple regarded the scene with calm attentiveness, noting the subtleties others ignored. The direction of the brush strokes, the irregular impressions of snow depicted in paint, and the peculiar tilt of the figure's head in the composition, suggesting a very specific observation rather than a random depiction. Inspector Havisham arrived promptly, accompanied by Whitmore, eager to investigate this second clue. It must be the work of a prankster, or perhaps a misguided attempt to implicate Calver, the inspector declared. Whitmore nodded vigorously, eager to align himself with authority. Yes, it fits neatly with our previous suspicions. He's the newcomer, after all. It is the simplest solution. Miss Marple, however, noticed something that went entirely unremarked by the others. The canvas bore a faint smudge, almost imperceptible to the eye, in the lower corner, a small smear of crimson, consistent with the mark she had noted at the fountain days earlier. She stooped quietly, letting her gaze linger without comment. The smear, combined with the placement of the painting, suggested deliberation and familiarity, not random happenstance. It was a trace left intentionally by someone who had observed Halloway, someone who understood his movements and habits intimately. By midday, the village chatter had reached a fever pitch. The blacksmith, standing near the forge, loudly declared that Halloway had no doubt been abducted, citing the uncanny eeriness of the painting as proof. Mrs. Pemberton fretted over the symbolism, murmuring that the shadowy figure must represent an intruder, someone known to Halloway, and possibly someone they all overlooked. Even the vicar speculated, cautiously, that the scene might represent a warning, a deliberate attempt by Halloway or his assailant to communicate a concealed truth. Miss Marple, as ever, allowed the villagers to speculate while she quietly traced the sequence of events. She remembered the cane imprint, the discarded glove, the smear of paint on the fountain, and the gardener's subtle agitation the previous day. One possibility crystallized slowly in her mind. The true instigator might not be the obvious suspect, but someone who moved with knowledge of the estate, someone with freedom to approach the grounds unnoticed and with a precise understanding of Halloway's routines. It was then, as she examined the canvas more closely, that she noticed another detail. The shadowy figure in the painting carried a faintly indicated bundle beneath one arm, an object partially obscured by the thick brushstrokes. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This was no random figure. It was deliberate, almost a clue, suggesting possession of an item that might prove significant. The artist, or the imitator, had intended the detail to be seen only by the perceptive, only by someone paying attention to the nuances. Later in the afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mr. Hemsley, the gardener, under the pretense of inquiring about the orchard. She asked casually about the paths Arthur often walked and the direction he preferred when venturing through the snow. Hemsley, flustered by her gentle questioning, gave careful, deliberate responses. Yet Miss Marple observed the faint blush on his cheeks, the subtle tremor in his hands, and the repeated adjustment of his gloves, an almost imperceptible reaction to her mention of the orchard. "Did Arthur ever take his easel there?" she asked innocently, gesturing toward the orchard. Yes, sometimes," Hemsley replied, voice tight. He liked to paint the trees. He said the snow transformed them, made them more alive. He hesitated, as if weighing words, then added hurriedly, I didn't see him yesterday." Miss Marple nodded, observing him closely. The hesitation, the almost imperceptible pause, suggested a familiarity with the location and the easel's placement. He had been there, she suspected, and yet he avoided directly admitting it. The revelation was subtle, almost too slight for anyone else to notice, but for Miss Marple, it was a thread worth following. Returning to the Witchwood estate later, she spoke with Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, under the guise of discussing domestic matters. She casually mentioned the canvas, its placement, and the direction of the figure in the painting. Mrs. Pritchard's reaction, though composed, betrayed the faintest flicker of recognition, her fingers tightening on the teacup, her eyes straying momentarily to the window as if ensuring no one was watching. Miss Marple made a quiet mental note. People rarely concealed knowledge without revealing some trace, however minute. It was the accumulation of these small, almost invisible signals that revealed what the villagers' assumptions could not, who had acted, and why. By evening, the villagers gathered again at the inn, discussing the painting, the disappearance, and the implications with increasing urgency. Calver, naturally, remained a convenient target for their speculation. Yet Miss Marple, seated quietly near the hearth, saw clearly that the web of suspicion had shifted. The second clue, the carefully placed painting, the faint smear of crimson, the subtle depiction of the bundle, pointed not outward to the newcomer, but inward, towards someone who moved within the village with intimate knowledge of Arthur Halloway's habits. As the fire crackled and conversation ebbed and flowed around her, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The twist, she realized, had clarified more than it obscured. The true challenge now was not merely to identify the culprit, but to understand the mind that had acted so subtly, leaving breadcrumbs for the careful observer to follow. And in Little Hemsby, under the deepening twilight, she quietly resolved to continue her patient, understated investigation, knowing that each small revelation brought her closer to the inevitable truth. The following morning dawned clear and bright over Little Hemsby, but beneath the crystalline light, the tension that had settled over the village since Arthur Halloway's disappearance had not eased. Villagers moved about with hushed voices and darting glances, each quietly guarding secrets while attempting to unearth those of their neighbors. Miss Marple, as ever, appeared calm and unhurried, though her mind worked tirelessly, assembling the final pieces of a puzzle that had grown more intricate with each passing day. She had spent the previous evening reviewing every observation she had made: the crimson smudge, the abandoned glove, the subtle agitation of Mr. Hemsley, and the second canvas left in the orchard. All clues, minor on their own, pointed to a hidden web of motives and concealed actions. Yet, to confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple knew she would require more than observation alone. She needed a response, a subtle reaction from the one whose guilt had so far remained carefully veiled. Miss Marple decided upon a psychological test, quiet and indirect, one that would allow her to gauge not actions but human instinct. She chose to invite several villagers for afternoon tea at her cottage, a setting informal enough to encourage natural conversation, yet contained enough to allow close observation. Among them were Whitmore, Mrs. Pemberton, and Mr. Hemsley, whose recent behavior had drawn her attention most sharply. Edwin Calver, conspicuously, was not included, for she suspected he was merely an observer of events rather than an actor within them. As the guests arrived, Miss Marple greeted each with her customary warmth, offering tea and a selection of small cakes. Conversation began lightly, focused initially on mundane matters: the persistence of the snow, the state of the orchards, and the subtle beauty of the frost-laden trees. The casual, unassuming topics provided a backdrop against which reactions to more pointed remarks could be carefully monitored. Once tea had been poured and the conversation had settled into an easy rhythm, Miss Marple steered the discussion toward Arthur Halloway's routines. She spoke softly, almost as if reminiscing aloud. "I was reflecting, on Arthur's habit of painting at dawn, especially when the frost had settled on the orchard. There is something almost magical about the way snow alters perspective, don't you agree?" Whitmore offered a polite nod, masking an underlying restlessness. Mrs. Pemberton smiled faintly, but quickly shifted the topic to village children. It was Mr. Hemsley, however, whose reaction was most telling. He placed his teacup slightly more forcefully on the saucer, fingers lingering over the edge as if seeking support. His eyes flicked toward the window, then back to Miss Marple, and the faintest tension appeared in the line of his jaw. Miss Marple allowed the pause to extend just long enough for observation. The smallest hesitation, the involuntary tightening of muscles, the subtle reddening of cheeks. These were precisely the indicators she sought. Human nature, she understood, betrayed truth in the moments when one believed no one was truly watching. She continued, gently probing further. "It is curious, is it not?" she mused aloud, "how someone might leave a painting in the orchard, upright and yet abandoned, almost as if to suggest that the artist had been interrupted or frightened." A faint, nearly imperceptible shiver passed across Mr. Hemsley's shoulders. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his coat, and cast a glance toward Mrs. Pritchard, who had accompanied him quietly. Neither spoke, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught every nuance. The hesitation in breathing, the minuscule frown of concern, the sudden tightening of the fingers. Interruptions, Miss Marple went on lightly, can take many forms, can they not? Sometimes one is startled by the unexpected, other times by someone quite familiar. It is remarkable how our trust in those around us can be so easily shaken, even when we believe ourselves secure. The comment hung in the air, seeming innocent, yet calculated precisely to elicit a response. Mrs. Pemberton, for her part, murmured agreement, the faintest tremor in her tone betraying unease, but nothing incriminating. Whitmore adjusted his chair, but otherwise remained neutral. Mr. Hemsley's reaction, however, deepened. A slight blanch, a cough, and the instinctive movement of his hands toward his lap as if to hide them. Miss Marple's eyes followed each movement closely. She noted how he avoided looking directly at the canvas that rested in her sitting-room corner, a faithful reproduction of the shadowy figure from the orchard. She realized then that the man was reacting not to what was said, but to what was unsaid, the psychological suggestion that his secret might be inferred. Seizing upon the moment, Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, lowering her voice, her tone gentle yet deliberate. "It is often the smallest detail," she said, "that tells the story more clearly than the largest gesture. A trace of paint, a footprint, the careless smear of a glove. One need only observe carefully, and the truth reveals itself. Some see it instantly, others only in time." Mr. Hemsley's gaze darted toward the window once more, then back to Miss Marple. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve, and a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped him. It was the final, involuntary reaction Miss Marple had been waiting for. A silent acknowledgement that he understood the implication, yet dared not speak it aloud. Satisfied, she allowed the conversation to drift again toward lighter matters. The frost on the orchard trees, the inevitable arrival of spring, and the quaint curiosities of village life. Yet beneath the surface, she now possessed the certainty she had sought. The reactions, small as they were, had revealed more than any interrogation could. Human nature, as she had always known, could not conceal guilt entirely when confronted with the right subtle provocation. As the tea concluded and her guests departed, Miss Marple remained in her chair, knitting quietly by the fire. The test had been subtle, almost imperceptible in its execution, yet the results were unmistakable. The psychological threads had been carefully tugged, and the responses, however restrained, had woven a clear picture of knowledge, involvement, and motive. In Little Hemsby, where snow glimmered beneath the setting sun and the village exhaled quietly in anticipation of the coming evening, Miss Marple sat poised, her mind calm, her observations complete. She now possessed the final confirmation she required. The puzzle was almost entirely assembled, the pieces arranged with precision. The final act, the revelation that would draw together every hidden clue and subtle signal, was close at hand. And as the last light of day fell over the snow-covered cottages, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. The game had been set, the reactions observed, and the truth was poised to emerge in the manner only she could orchestrate. Gentle, deliberate, and devastatingly precise. The following afternoon, Miss Marple invited the villagers once more to the Witchwood estate, under the pretense of discussing arrangements for the painter's return, or, failing that, a formal notice of disappearance. The sun was pale and weak, filtering through the overcast sky, casting a muted glow over the snow-laden garden. The villagers, unaware of the purpose behind this gathering, arrived with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, their conversations halting as they took in the composed figure of Miss Marple by the hearth. She greeted each politely, offering tea and small cakes before seating everyone in a semicircle that allowed her to observe their expressions and subtle gestures. Her plan was simple, yet meticulously calculated: to reconstruct the events that had led to Arthur Halloway's disappearance, revealing the connections between motive, opportunity, and subtle human behavior, while observing responses that would confirm her deductions. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice gentle, almost unassuming. "I feel it is time we consider carefully the peculiar circumstances of Arthur Halloway's absence. Some might find the sequence of events confusing, even contradictory, but when one examines the details closely, patterns begin to emerge." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Whitmore shifted in his chair, while Mrs. Pemberton's fingers nervously fidgeted with her handkerchief. Mr. Hemsley, however, avoided eye contact, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on him, noting the subtle tension that remained despite his outward composure. "You may recall," she continued, "the first evidence we observed, a faint smear of crimson on the fountain's edge. To some it seemed trivial, perhaps even accidental, yet it suggested contact with a substance transferred by someone familiar with the estate." Her gaze lingered on Mr. Hemsley, whose faint blanch did not go unnoticed. "Next," she said, moving seamlessly to the second clue, was the abandoned glove, small and misplaced, found near the orchard. This, too, was insignificant at first glance, yet it indicated the presence of someone who moved through the grounds with ease, unnoticed, and with a purpose only partially revealed. A slight murmur passed through the group. Whitmore cleared his throat and attempted a skeptical smile, but Miss Marple's gentle, patient tone left no room for interruption. She continued, recounting the discovery of the canvas in the orchard, the precise depiction of the shadowy figure, and the faint crimson smudge in the corner, each detail a thread in the web she had been quietly assembling. "It is often the smallest, most seemingly inconsequential signs," she said, "that betray the truth. Human nature, as we all know, cannot entirely conceal itself. Gestures, reactions, and hesitations reveal more than words ever could." Here, she allowed a pause, letting the weight of her words settle, before focusing on the pivotal moment, the reactions she had observed during her psychological test at the cottage. "When I spoke of the orchard, the easel, and the paintings, I noticed reactions that were neither accidental nor casual. Some of you remained calm, composed. Others betrayed subtle anxiety." Her eyes met Mr. Hemsley's for the briefest moment, and his gaze wavered under her steady observation. "Consider," she went on, her tone still mild, "the behaviors observed in seemingly ordinary circumstances. The shifting of hands, the avoidance of eye contact, the hesitation in response to innocent questions. Each is a trace of thought, a small yet meaningful signal that reveals what the conscious mind might wish to conceal." A deep, hushed silence settled over the group. Even Whitmore, usually eager to assert authority, found no words. Mrs. Pemberton's breath caught in her chest, her hands clutching the handkerchief more tightly. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "It is these signals, observed carefully over time, that have allowed me to reconstruct the events leading to Arthur Halloway's disappearance. The painter did not leave of his own volition. He was taken, briefly restrained, and then released in a manner designed to obscure the truth, leaving only subtle hints for those who know where and how to look." She paused, giving the gathered villagers the impression she was merely reflecting on the situation. Then, in quiet, precise tones, she delivered the culmination of her reasoning. "The person who did this is not the newcomer, Edwin Calver, though he has been a convenient focus of suspicion. Nor is it anyone whose resentment was distant or indirect. The individual who acted knew the estate intimately, understood Arthur's habits, and could move through the grounds unnoticed. They also had motive, subtle and hidden: jealousy, a long-held grievance, and fear of exposure." Mr. Hemsley's hands tightened, a faint tremor passing through his arms. Miss Marple's eyes, calm and patient, met his. "Yes, Mr. Hemsley," she said softly. "It was you who, in a moment of anger and fear, removed Arthur from his usual path, leaving traces that only a careful observer could interpret. The crimson smudge, the glove, the canvas in the orchard. These were the markers of your presence, each a detail you could not control fully, because human nature leaves its imprint. Hemsley's lips parted, then closed again, the first words caught in the tension of realization. Mrs. Pemberton's gasp was barely audible. Whitmore's eyes widened, and even the vicar, present as an observer, leaned forward, astonishment plain upon his face. I didn't mean, Hemsley began, voice trembling. I only wanted... I never thought... Miss Marple shook her head gently. Intent and action are separate matters, Mr. Hemsley. You acted out of anger and jealousy, yes, but the consequences were more significant than you anticipated. And yet the method, subtle and precise, has allowed the truth to be discerned by patient observation rather than by force or accusation. She rose and moved toward the window, gesturing to the orchard beyond. Arthur Halloway walked these paths frequently, unaware of the quiet intentions of someone he trusted. Your careful planning, your subtle movements, and your inability to entirely conceal your anxiety have revealed the truth that others, seeing only surface details, failed to detect. The room remained silent, save for Hemsley's shallow, panicked breathing. The truth had emerged not through loud accusation, nor dramatic confrontation, but through the patient accumulation of observation and understanding, a gentle unraveling of deception, orchestrated with the precision only Miss Marple could command. By the time the villagers departed, Hemsley escorted by the authorities under polite, formal directions, the tension in the room had shifted from speculation to quiet acknowledgement. The puzzle was complete. The mystery resolved, though not without leaving a residue of unease over human nature and the hidden motives that could exist even in the quietest of villages. Miss Marple, alone now by the hearth, reflected on the simplicity and complexity of the case alike. The truth, she mused, lay not in the dramatic or the obvious, but in the subtle patterns, the tiny gestures, and the persistent, careful attention to human behavior. And in little Hemsby, under the fading winter light, she felt once more the quiet satisfaction of having discerned what so many overlooked. The human heart, in all its contradictions, always leaves a trace. The snow had begun to thaw in little Hemsby, the pale winter sun melting the hard crust of ice that had so long coated the village lanes. Children ventured out once more, their boots leaving playful tracks alongside the lingering footprints of a more somber week. And yet, despite the return of routine and the soft stirrings of life, a quiet tension remained. The events surrounding Arthur Halloway's disappearance and the revelation of Mr. Hemsley's involvement had left an indelible mark upon the village, a reminder that beneath the gentle veneer of civility, human emotions could be both intricate and dangerous. Miss Marple walked slowly along the main street, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She observed the villagers with her customary calm curiosity, noting how some had resumed their routines with outward cheerfulness, while others moved with a subtle hesitancy, as though unsure whether the world could ever be entirely safe again. The inn's windows reflected the soft light of afternoon, and inside, Mrs. Pemberton busied herself serving tea to a small group of patrons, her expression composed yet tinged with residual anxiety. Even as life returned to a semblance of normality, Miss Marple noted the lingering signs of disruption, a faint whisper of distrust in casual conversations, careful glances over shoulders, and the restrained laughter of those who had once been comfortable in the village's predictability. Small-town life, she thought, could be fragile indeed, its smooth surface easily disturbed by a single act of deception or anger. The Witchwood estate, too, began to reclaim its quiet dignity. The gardens, now glistening with melting snow, held an eerie beauty, their bare branches traced sharply against the pale sky. Miss Marple visited the estate's study, where she found Mrs. Pritchard dusting the shelves with methodical precision. The housekeeper's demeanor had returned largely to its former composure, though Miss Marple detected a subtle change. A quieter vigilance, an awareness that the village's placid rhythm had been unsettled by events that could so easily recur. "They're recovering well, I think," Miss Marple said gently, her gaze falling on the familiar furniture and framed landscapes. "It is remarkable how quickly the ordinary routines of life can resume, even after something so unexpected has occurred." Mrs. Pritchard nodded, her hands paused in mid-dust. "Yes, ma'am, but there is a different air now. People look and think and question in ways they didn't before. Even the children seem to sense it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, that is the way of the world, Mrs. Pritchard. Events leave their mark, subtle but persistent, upon those who live through them, and yet, as always, life continues." In the following days, the villagers gradually resumed their usual routines. Market days were busy once more. The post office echoed with cheerful chatter, and the blacksmith's hammer rang confidently on the anvil. Yet every so often, a whisper of the recent events surfaced in conversations, a mention of the orchard, the abandoned easel, or the shadowy figure in the painting. People speculated quietly about Mr. Hemsley's motives, about what he might have felt in the moments that led to his actions, and about the fragile boundary between ordinary life and the potential for quiet darkness. Miss Marple, of course, observed all of this with her characteristic patience. She noted that some villagers had learned caution, curbing their impulsive gossip. Others seemed more openly reflective, sharing their impressions with careful attention to nuance. And in all of them, she recognized the subtle reshaping of human behavior, a gentle reminder that events of consequence, however resolved, rarely left no trace. One afternoon, she took a solitary walk to the orchard, now devoid of snow. The path Arthur Halloway had frequented stretched before her, the ground soft and slightly muddy beneath her boots. She paused, considering the events that had unfolded here. The painter's disappearance, the careful placement of the easel, and the psychological trails left by Mr. Hemsley. Even now, the orchard seemed charged with quiet significance, as if the land itself remembered the unfolding of human passions and missteps. Miss Marple's thoughts turned, inevitably, to Hemsley. He had acted out of a combination of jealousy, fear, and a desire to assert control over what he perceived as a slight or an injustice. Yet the consequences of his actions, though ultimately revealed and contained, had rippled outward, affecting the entire village. She reflected on the complexity of human motives, the intertwining of emotion, habit, and opportunity that could lead otherwise ordinary people to commit unexpected deeds. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, knitting quietly. Outside, the sun had begun to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the softening snow. She considered the villagers she had observed in recent weeks, their mannerisms, their whispered conversations, the subtle signals of tension and relief. Each individual had displayed a unique combination of vulnerability and restraint, just as every act of concealment had left faint traces for a careful observer to notice. And yet, despite the disturbance and the revelation of hidden motives, Miss Marple felt a familiar calm. Human nature, she mused, was endlessly fascinating precisely because it was predictable in its subtleties and yet endlessly variable in its expression. She had guided the village through the aftermath of mystery, not with force or dramatic confrontation, but with observation, patience, and the quiet insistence that truth could always be discerned by those who looked carefully enough. In Little Hemsby, life would continue, carrying with it the memory of a painter's sudden disappearance and the unmasking of a hidden secret. Children would play in the returning spring air, villagers would gossip and tend their routines, and the Witchwood estate would once again hold its quiet dignity. But the village, like all communities, had learned that beneath the familiar surface lay a complexity that could be revealed in a single moment by a single act. or by the careful eyes of someone who understood human nature in its fullest measure. Miss Marple, her knitting resting in her lap, reflected on this quietly. She thought of the subtle signals, the careful observations, and the gentle, persistent accumulation of knowledge that had brought clarity to a situation that initially seemed chaotic. And as the last light of day faded over Little Hemsby, she allowed herself a small, contented smile. The village would move forward, and she, as always, would watch, observe, and understand. For in the quiet resolution of human actions, in the interplay of motives and consequences, there was a lesson she knew well. The smallest details, the faintest reactions, and the quietest moments often revealed more than any loud confession ever could. And in that, Miss Marple found her enduring satisfaction, the unspoken mastery of understanding human nature, and the gentle certainty that, in time, truth could always be discerned. The village of Little Hemsby slowly returned to its accustomed rhythm, yet beneath the apparent normalcy lay the subtle echoes of recent events. Snow had fully melted now, leaving behind patches of damp earth and the lingering impressions of footprints, both literal and figurative, that told the story of the week's unsettling occurrences. Villagers moved about their days with a mixture of relief and lingering awareness. The air seemed lighter, yet the memory of hidden motives and human frailties remained, woven into the collective consciousness of the community. At the Witchwood estate, life resumed with its customary elegance. The gardens, now dotted with early spring blossoms, seemed almost to mock the tension that had previously gripped them. Mrs. Pritchard moved with renewed diligence, the house restored to its routine rhythm, while whispers of the events were replaced by quiet conversations about planting schedules and minor repairs. Even the orchard, the scene of Arthur Halloway's mysterious vanishing, had reclaimed a peaceful dignity. Its paths were walked again, yet with a subtle caution that suggested a village newly attuned to the quiet truths that could lie beneath everyday appearances. Miss Marple, as ever, observed without fanfare. From the window of her small cottage, she watched villagers tending to their tasks, noting small gestures and fleeting expressions with her customary patience. She understood the enduring lesson that the week had taught, that human nature, with all its hidden fears, jealousies, and resentments, could be revealed in the smallest signs. A glance, a hesitation, a seemingly minor action. These were the threads from which the truth could be discerned. Arthur Halloway, it was understood, had returned to his home safely, though a quiet shyness lingered about him. His paintings, once abandoned and mysterious, now lay carefully stored, reminders of both his talent and the unexpected drama that had unfolded around him. The villagers, grateful for his safety, spoke of him in terms tinged with admiration and mild caution. He had become, in a sense, a symbol of the village's newfound awareness of the subtleties of human behavior. Mr. Hemsley, whose actions had caused so much disruption, had been held to account with due formality, though Miss Marple recognized that the consequences extended beyond legal or social reprimand. The quiet shame, the self-awareness of having acted out of jealousy and impulse, was a burden he would carry for some time. Yet the village, though wary, continued to function, subtly altered by the revelation that even the most familiar individuals might conceal unknown depths of emotion or intention. Miss Marple's satisfaction, however, was not in the punishment or the resolution alone. It lay in the understanding that truth could always be perceived if one observed carefully, patiently, and without the need for dramatic interference. Her subtle accumulation of clues, her quiet psychological tests, and her patient observation of human nature had brought clarity where others might have seen only chaos. The mystery had unfolded not through confrontation or evidence alone, but through insight into character, behavior, and the delicate interplay of emotion and motive. In the evenings, Miss Marple would sit by her fire, knitting quietly and reflecting on the events. She considered the patterns she had seen. The crimson smudge at the fountain, the abandoned glove, the canvas placed in the orchard, and the minute signs of guilt and anxiety displayed by those involved. Each element, she mused, was a reminder that life's truths often reside in the smallest, most understated details, waiting to be discerned by those with patience and discernment. The village, though outwardly serene, had been forever altered. Conversations were now punctuated by careful observation, gestures carried more meaning than before, and an unspoken awareness lingered that appearances could deceive. Yet the essence of Little Hemsby remained unchanged, a small, close-knit community, capable of warmth, curiosity, and resilience. And at its heart, the subtle presence of Miss Marple remained a quiet guardian of understanding, ensuring that even in the face of hidden motives, human nature could be interpreted with grace and clarity. As she watched the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the thawing fields, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The painter had returned, the mystery had been resolved, and the village could move forward. Yet she knew, as she always did, that life was an endless tapestry of human action, woven from countless threads of desire, fear, and subtle intention. Each thread, carefully observed, could reveal truths that were invisible to the unseeing eye. And so Little Hemsby settled into its quiet rhythm once more, the snow and its footprints long gone, but the lessons of observation, patience, and human insight lingering in the hearts of those who had witnessed the unusual events of a single, extraordinary week. For Miss Marple, the story was complete, not in dramatic flourish or public acknowledgement, but in the serene, unwavering knowledge that understanding human nature was the greatest mystery of all, and the one she had mastered most thoroughly. In the stillness of her cottage, with the fire crackling gently, she contemplated the subtle, enduring truth of the village and its people. Life, she reflected, was a delicate balance between the visible and the hidden, and in that balance lay the wisdom, the caution, and the gentle satisfaction that comes from discerning what others might overlook. And with that quiet reflection, Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment, content in the knowledge that, in Little Hemsby, the mystery had been resolved, justice subtly served, and human nature observed in all its intricate, revealing beauty.